all of our tutors are either Ivy League, a lot of them Columbia, some of them Yale, some of them a few other schools as well. And everyone who works for us is top 1% in whatever they tutor, whether it's SATs or what have you. That's me. So my background, I've been tutoring for a little over 15 years at this point. Started when I was a freshman in college. Came up here and did my PhD at Yale in theoretical biophysics, which is almost 7 years ago at this point. Founded kind of our sister company, which is called Bulldog Tutors, which is in New Haven, about 6 years ago at this point. And then Lion, we founded last year, so we've been operating for 1 year. Just a little about me, and that's Amanda, who works with us and sets up all these presentations. And Cliff might be coming in, who's one of my co-founders for this. So just what we're going to be talking about today, comparing the new SAT and the ACT. So as you guys probably know, there's a new SAT released March of last year, so about 1 year into that new SAT. A little bit about what's changed in that, the scoring, the structure, and then comparing that to the ACT. And then the question, which test should I take and how do I figure that out? And then a little bit on college timeline, kind of when you should be doing things, when you should anticipate doing things, and then depending on if you're thinking about being an athlete in college, how that timeline gets shifted a little bit. A lot of the fundamentals are the same, but the timing's a little bit different. Cool. So one thing I always want to point out, which I think is really important, especially when everyone gets to their junior year, they start thinking about how important the SATs and the ACTs are, and they are important, but they're only one part of your overall college application, that's the purpose of this slide. So your academics, your 4-year track record, right, matters a tremendous amount. It's probably the thing that matters the most on your application. Your extracurriculars, whether that's sports, athletics, or other stuff that you do, your standardized test, your SAT, ACT, if you have to take SAT 2 subject tests depending on what school you go to, and finally that last piece, which is the college application, essentially putting that all together. But it's important to remember, it's just 1/4 of that puzzle. An important fourth, but it's just 1/4. So remember that when thinking about it and not making this. So the SAT versus the ACT. So if you think about the SAT's evolved quite a bit, and it looks a lot more like the ACT now than it ever did before. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But at a high level, just the comparison between the two. And it's important to think about these things, and we'll show kind of a diagram about this later, about how to think about which one to take. So first, the SAT doesn't have a science section. The ACT does. One thing that's interesting about the ACT science section is you don't have to know any actual science content. It's all given to you there, right? It's more about reading comprehension and interpretations of graphs and charts and tables, etc. The SAT has an optional essay, so does the ACT. They're just different than what they ask you to do. So the SAT asks you to evaluate an argument, while the ACT asks you to develop and support an argument. One of the bigger differences between the two tests now is the math section. They test similar math, a little bit different, but pretty similar. The SAT has a fill in the blank, so not everything is multiple choice in the math section now, which is new in this new version of the SAT. And it has a whole section where your calculator is not allowed, right? Where the ACT, it's all multiple choice, and your calculator is allowed in all the ACT questions. And then lastly, the SAT is less time intensive than the ACT. The ACT tries to shove more questions into a shorter amount of time. By and large, as a result, ACT questions are a little bit easier than SAT questions because you have less time for them. So this is a high-level comparison of the two. We'll come back to that. So one question I often get asked is, like, why would they redesign the test, right? The test has been around for a long time, but it's had several versions. So you think about the SAT that your parents probably took, or people took it in the 60s and 70s, was very different than even the one people took in the 90s. So it started about mid-90s. They made the test significantly easier. It was originally formulated as an IQ test to see kind of where you sat in that scale. Mid-90s, they made it a little bit different, trying to make it more to see how ready you were for college. And that test lasted for a little while, and then in mid-2000s, they changed it to the 2,400 point exam, where it's the English, the reading, the writing, the English, and the math section. And that lasted for about 10 years until last year. And the interesting thing about that was when they looked at people at, let's call them satisfactory scores on the SAT, they were still taking a lot of remedial classes in college. right? So the SAT was supposed to show how ready you were for college, and it wasn't very effective at that. And so what they did was say, hey, how do we change the SAT to make it more like that? And one of the things the SAT did, which is why it changed to be more like the ACT, is they hired the guy who had developed the ACT. So SAT hired him over, he came over and it was really the architect of the redesign, and still works there. So that's why a lot of the themes look pretty similar. And you even see in how they score things, how things are broken down, that there's a lot of overlap between the two. So the old 2400 SAT had obscure passages, so passages you couldn't Google, things they wrote specifically for the SAT. The new one only has passages that you can Google and find other places. They're real passages. Irrelevant vocabulary, everybody remembers the analogies and things like that. Inapplicable mathematics and poorly focused English testing. And now the idea with the new SAT, and obviously we're still kind of in the first 10 months of that, and they're gathering data on it, is for it to more to map better to performance in college. Any questions about this stuff so far? Cool. So the SAT, the redesigned one, the new SAT, is back to a 1,600 point exam, which is what everyone is, what people are more familiar with. It's a mathematics test, and then an evidence-based reading and writing test. So that's a reading comprehension plus your English, your grammar, etc. And then an optional essay, which doesn't affect your overall 1,600 point score. Used to on the new SAT. So this will look a lot like the ACT, and I think this is interesting from more of a preparation standpoint than anything else. So you have your two 800-point sections. That's the test. That's the score you send to colleges, right? And then there's sub-scores, and these sub-scores are all at 15 points. And you'll see they're broken down by math and then the verbal section. And those are really important because if you take a test early on, which you should plan to take one early on, and you get your result back, you can see where you have some areas where you have some room for improvement and where you should be focusing your study. So if you didn't do as well in hard algebra or command of evidence, you know that I need to focus on those types of questions and either learning content or learning how to take that strategy, whatever it happens to be. There's also cross-test scores, which is, again, pretty similar to the ACT, where they have one in analysis and history and social studies, which is interpreting charts and graphs around that, and then analysis in science, which is a science passage or two in the reading comprehension. And each test score each of those is out of 40. One thing that's important to know is these are the scores that impact your admissions. These scores don't, right? Obviously these kind of correlate to those, right? But the universities aren't really looking at these yet. Maybe they will, but they haven't so far. So every SAT, just like the ACT, has the same structure, right? So you start out, you have a reading test, it's 65 minutes, writing and language test, 35 minutes, then a no calculator math section, which is relatively short, it's only 25 minutes, and then a mathematics test with a calculator, which is 55 minutes, and then an optional fifth essay. So all in, you're at 230 minutes with the essay, which is a fair amount of time. So one of the things, especially when you're thinking about prepping and getting ready for the test, is building up that test endurance. Because often for students who are sophomores, juniors, earlier on in their academic career, they'll take longer tests when they get to college and grad school if they go that far. They're not used to sitting and concentrating for that amount of time, right? So building up that test endurance over time by taking practice tests, concentrating for that amount of time is really important. Every question, save for the fill in the blank math questions on the SAT, is 4 multiple choice per question. And unlike the old SAT, there's no penalty for wrong answers anymore. So usually you get a quarter point deducted for every wrong answer you had. That's no longer the case. So if you are running out of time, you have 30 seconds left, filling in all C is a viable strategy on the SAT when it used to not be a viable strategy. Cool. Any questions about the SAT or the redesign or anything like that?
Optional essay. Any questions on that?
Yeah. Actually, in the optional essay. So you're pretty much do you know any type of questions they would give you, or
what the essay would look like?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are examples out there of what that looks like, and they're all pretty similar. So if you go onto the College Board's website, I I think there's still only 3 or 4, I can't remember the exact number, practice exams on there, and you look like those essays always look roughly like that, and it's a lot more about like the question type doesn't matter as much. It's more about like your writing style and how you support evaluate that argument in that case.
Yeah, our school did PSAT this
Yeah.
year, but we didn't have the optional essay part.
Okay.
So that was it.
It doesn't impact your score out of 1600. So
Okay.
it's really just, I mean, we always say it's really for people who are very confident in their writing skills. It's just kind of one extra chance to sort of show your voice and what makes you special. But sometimes I asked if anyone had any questions because I think that trips people up a little bit. Optional, that's kind of a completely new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's
Yep.
right. Cool. So ACT, which I think is often the test people are a little bit less familiar with, especially parents. I think the students are often pretty familiar with it. So the scoring is very different. It's 36 points for English, math, reading, and science, and then there's an optional essay in this as well. Your composite, each section's out of 36, and then your composite score, your overall score, is an average of those 4 sections, which is also out of 36. So you'll see this looks a lot like the SAT. We have a bunch of sub-scores. So again, these are valuable at the preparation level. Like where do I need to focus my studying time? Where do I lack content? Where do I lack strategy? Whatever it happens to be. And there's essentially these cross-test scores as well. So similar to the SAT. That's not an accident. The guy that developed that now works for the SAT. So not surprising he did that. But those are more valuable in where should I spend my time in studying and preparing for the exam. So just like the SAT, the ACT has a structure that's always the same. And you should be familiar with this before you take the test. So first is English 45 minutes, then math 60, reading 35, and science 35, and then your optional 5th, which is that writing essay piece. So if you notice, the time is a little bit shorter on the ACT. More questions, but shorter amount of time. That's why it's a little bit more time intensive. And logistically, there's 4 to 5 multiple choices per question, and there's never been a penalty for wrong answers in the ACT, and that's still the same. And the ACT really hasn't changed for 25-ish years. There's not been much of a change in the ACT. It's been pretty consistent as an exam. The thing that has changed, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, is now every college in the country takes both the SAT and the ACT, where it used to be more regional which one they took. So no matter which exam you take, the colleges will look at that.
So I have a question. So does the structure for test, is this the structure that is
Yep.
English first and then math and then?
This will be the structure on test day.
Yeah.
Yep. And so you know the predictable structure of like here's what I have to go through every time.
And really important to remember too that you don't have to be a science whiz to take the ACT. It's not really about how much science you know content-wise. It's
Yeah.
like Mike said, it's about being able to interpret graphs and sort of comprehend that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's right. Any questions about the ACT?
And the essay is optional here.
It is, yeah, it is.
So say the essay is written and the
Yeah.
scores are not that good. Can
Yeah.
we decide just to send the ACT scores but not the essay scores?
Right. So there's the like when you sign up for the SAT, you can pick the colleges that you want and then choose to release the score or not, and you can kill that at the end. If you've chosen to take the essay, and you have to send the whole thing.
Okay.
Right. If you have
That's-
those pre-scores, they see the whole thing. That's
Okay.
right.
How many kids would you say, I mean on average, what percentage of kids do the optional essay versus don't do the optional essay?
I think we get, for Lion and Bulldog, we get a different subset of students,
Right.
right? So I don't know the overall percentage, but we often get students who are aiming for the tougher universities.
And they do them.
They often do it. It's
Yeah.
probably 50-50. Some of them are just like, I'm a terrible writer
Right.
under time pressure, and I'm not going to do that. It doesn't
Right.
help me. But a lot of them are really good students, and they figure out how
Right.
to do well at that. I'd imagine it's probably less than 50. I don't actually know, but
Mhm.
my guess is less than 50% for like the general population.
Got it.
Cool. So I think one of the things that, it's a question I get all the time, I think Amanda gets all the time, is like, which test should I take, right? So I think everyone has this idea that there's this magical answer where like, I'm gonna take this test and I'm gonna do so much better than I did in the other. And like the reality is, tests aren't all that different anymore, right? They're a little bit different, and there's some ways to think about this, which we're going to talk about, but you're probably going to be okay no matter which one you take. But there's some ways to think about how do I determine which one I should take and I'll be best on. So the first is take a diagnostic, right? So maybe take the PSAT. I also find if you took the PSAT your fall of your junior year, even by spring of your junior year, you're going to do a lot better on that because you have a lot more content, right? So it's important before you start tutoring or studying, whatever happens to be, you take an SAT diagnostic, you take an ACT diagnostic, and you compare